Hello and welcome to this telesummit on feminism as a sustainability tool. I'm Jenny Lamorgan, owner of greenwomanstore.com, where we enjoy creating educational tools like this telesummit and podcast series on topics important to us as women. I'm excited to be here with our co-host, Carolyn Gage, to bring you experts on the topic of feminism with case studies from the U.S. and around the world. These two collective quests, feminism and sustainability, touch every aspect of our lives. Feminism has always brought hope, a lot of hard work, and truth to whatever issue it touches. We'll talk about the sustainability of feminism and the important role that feminism plays in human development and real, lasting, and global sustainability. Our goal is to bring you hope for the future and a reality that doesn't live in denial. We can trust Carolyn Gage to facilitate these truths with clarity and grace. Carolyn is a lesbian feminist playwright, performer, director, and activist. She is the author of 12 books, some of which we sell on Green Woman Store. Carolyn has also written more than 65 plays, musicals, and one-woman shows. She specializes in non-traditional roles for women and reclaims famous women's stories that have been distorted or erased from history completely. In 2014, Carolyn was one of 6 featured playwrights at the 53rd Annual Theater Day in Rome, sponsored by UNESCO. And now I'll introduce our guest, poet, author, and one of the founding mothers of the lesbian, feminist, and women's spirituality movements in the United States, Professor Judy Grahn. Judy initiated and participated in profound cultural shifts brought about by the women's and gay rights movements of the 1960s and 70s. She participated in not just the formation of new institutions like the Women's Press Collective, the Oakland Feminist Women's Health Center, and a Women's Place bookstore, but she also participated in the creation of whole new ways of living, including collective feminist households that cut through the political and social isolation women experience. Most recently, Judy is co-directing an online master's course, and the graduates of her women's spirituality courses continue to use their degrees as a catalyst for change in themselves, in their communities, and in the world. Carolyn Gage and Judy Grahn are two of my biggest and dearest heroines. When I had brain damage from environmental toxins, Judy's poetry and Carolyn's book, Like There's No Tomorrow, were the only books I could read and comprehend. I believe it's because theirs is the language of truth. These two women strengthen and heal our hearts. So now I'm going to sit back with you and turn the mic over to Carolyn Gage, and we'll listen to these two very honorable feminists discuss feminism and sustainability. Enjoy this discussion with me. Welcome, Carolyn Gage.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, and I have to say this is a huge privilege. I can remember the very first contact I had with Judy Grahn's poetry, and I think I didn't even know who it was. It was some little poster in a vegetarian restaurant, 1973 or 74, in Boulder, Colorado, and it was a common woman is as common as a loaf of bread and will rise. And I liked it so much that I embroidered it and I gave it to the woman I was in love with at the time. And I think it was years later when I found out where that came from, which is the Common Woman poems. So this is a huge privilege for me. It's just wonderful. Judy, I guess one of the things I wanted to start with is sustainability. That's sort of the theme of these podcasts. Can you speak to, is poetry part of sustainability?
I wouldn't have thought about that if Jenny hadn't put that question on the table for our interview, and because she's connecting sustainability with feminism and with lesbian feminism. And the more I thought about it, the more wise I thought that connection, of course, is. Poetry sustains in part because it accesses the intuitive parts of our brains, and in a sense, it takes us back into a childhood language place where we first felt so connected to nature anyway. So to me, poets always, they at root, poets address the sacred, and that means they address connection, and that means, they address not only truth but also beauty, which is about nature and everything that Mother Nature gives us. So yeah, I would say yes to that. It might be a stretch in some cases, but it certainly isn't for feminist poetry. And looking back even at the Common Woman poems, I was struck by how many creature connections are in those poems, which I wrote when I was 29 years old, back in 1969. That thunderstorm, to compare a woman to a rattlesnake, to compare her to a crow, and so on, they're an essential parts of those poems. And women resonated with that. They resonated with the truth-telling of these portraits of ordinary women who had not appeared in poetry before. And they also were not off-put by, to have a rattlesnake. That the poem that compares the power of a single mother waitress with the power of a rattlesnake continues to resonate, and people continue to publish that poem and put it in textbooks and teach it and so on. So there's that piece of it, that connection.
Mhm. Yeah, well, yes, and I think that's really true. And of course, Jenny talking about it at a time when she was overwhelmed with environmental illness, and that she could access these poems. And I think it's partly what you said about, because it taps into the intuition. That's really powerful. It's very, very powerful.
Right, and love also, I think, is a piece of that comes through in the poetry.
Can you speak more about that? That love comes through in the poetry?
Well, I was just thinking, from Jenny's example, I had encephalitis when I was 25, and when I came out of it, I couldn't talk. All I could do was sing. And what I wanted to sing was a song from a play that had been written by the poet Archibald MacLeish that was about the end of the world. It was a kind of a revision of the Job story. And the song was, I love Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. It was a song of optimism, and it was very childlike in its optimism and in its sense that love prevails. So I was just resonating with that. But what's also sustainable in feminist poetry is the solidarity among women. Speaking of love, and solidarity, is an activist word, but it's actually a kind of, what can we say, a kind of a sacred erotic connection that women had that formed our movement, and that comes through in the poetry as well. It comes through in really ancient poetry, not only from Sappho, but even going further back into Sumerian poetry that's by priestesses addressing goddesses, and that kind of erotic love comes through in a very generalized way. The way that Audre Lorde meant when she said that the erotic is everywhere. It suffuses everything. So I'm thinking about that as well, of what that movement in the 70s, of what it generated. So in my memoir, A Simple Revolution, I just wrote a couple of paragraphs about that erotic sensibility and how we channeled it then toward various projects that would put women at the center of the world. That's what the bookstore that our household founded was called A Woman's Place, and the rest of that sentence is, a woman's place is in the world. And I
wanted to ask you about that. That's something that is likely to get lost historically, but that period of time when lesbians came together, forming collective households, that became so much more than just living arrangements.
Yes, totally. Yes, you're so right. It was immediately we did projects. We didn't sit and talk about our lives because we didn't have any vocabulary for what it was like, to be a lesbian. That was a dialogue that went on, but the main thing that we were doing was something out in the world. And I looked at 7 or 8 women's households for various aspects of what we were doing, and discovered that each household specialized in something in particular that was put out in the world. So one household that was of use to women and put women and children at the center. So while our household in Oakland, we always had a core of 7 or 8 lesbians living there, but like about 40 in the course of 5 or 6 years lived there altogether. And it was a bookstore and a printing press that we really excelled at, and art and, of course, poetry. But one of the other houses was offered to a group of our lesbian peers, all part of Gay Women's Liberation, as we called ourselves. They were offered this house if they would live upstairs and use the bottom part of the house as a women's center. And it virtually became the first women's shelter that any of us had ever even heard of, which just was invented on the spot out of a pressing need for women to escape their marriages to men who were battering them or intimidating them, or that they were just so poverty-stricken or wrecked by something that had happened to them that they made use of the bottom part of the house. And yet another one by another of, I guess we called ourselves comrades, that was a health center, that the women lived there, and it was their house at night, and in the daytime it was a health center. So, and so on. There was all of that, and it was propelled by this love, this love that women had for each other, that went way beyond romance and way beyond daily living. It was like a cosmic kind of sensibility. It was quite thrilling and challenging, and all that you might expect.
Yeah, and we were talking about this earlier, and I don't know that we will see this time again, because at that time, lesbians, if you were out and you were prioritizing your lesbian identity, you didn't have a very good shot at middle-class income. That your opportunities were very severely restricted because of homophobia. And so this was not, for many women, it wasn't that you could buy this house and, all of that. So there was not a lot of prospects if you were going to be an out lesbian in the outside world. And also, there wasn't all the artificial insemination, adoption, marriage, and all that. So for many of us, it was just where we could grow, where we could realize our dreams was in these collective visions of empowerment of other women, not setting personal, upwardly mobile goals or, family goals. And so I don't know that we'll see that time again, but I remember when I came out, I moved into the lesbian neighborhood. It was in Portland, Oregon, and I remember I was in a building that was, small studio apartments, and it was all women and mostly lesbians in that building. And one of my favorite memories was I woke up at 3 in the morning and there was a woman screaming on the sidewalk. And by the time I got down to the street, I looked out and there was a whole bunch of us, all in our pajamas and nightgowns with various things, baseball bats and so on, but just a spontaneous and collective response, waking up, woman in trouble on the street. Turns out she was differently minded. She was not being assaulted, but just making high-pitched noises in a somewhat different reality than other people. But I just felt the love of that moment, and thinking of all the places I had lived prior to that, student neighborhoods and so on, that would never have happened.
Right.
It was that time. Yeah, and not to say we weren't all scared, but we all understood what we had to do.
That's right. We weren't all scared. That the bigger vision mattered more. And what you're saying is so important about the households that I think needs to happen now, because I know that young people are organizing and want to continue organizing, and I can't stress enough how important it is to cut across those class lines in every way that you possibly can, not by denying them, but by making use of the different wisdoms that come from different class positions in the world. That was one of the strongest parts of our movement, was that there were people who were children of janitors and knew certain kinds of ways of being in the world and sustaining themselves, and people who were children of senators and heirs to vast fortunes from the newspaper industry and so on, who were rubbing elbows in these projects that we were doing. Everybody working in a concentrated kind of way. Well, the more people can do that, the more power the movement has. And it's not easy to do it, because everything in the culture wants to separate people. In the workplaces, people who are doing different jobs don't even eat lunch together. It's quite rigidly held in place, and you have to break through that. And that's where this kind of love comes into play, and why it is, I think, that lesbian feminists were so crucial in putting women's organizations in the public sphere and enabling women to come away from really corrupted family situations into reinventing themselves in some brand new ways. That needs to just continue happening, that kind of thing, expanded in all kinds of ways pertaining to sustainability of our earth, our world.
I think that is a truly beautiful vision, and I also think it's difficult to achieve. And it kind of reminds me of a little bit the trajectory of the Black Freedom Movement, where there was, in the beginning, tremendous, the Black Panthers organizing the breakfast for the children,
right.
And this community-mindedness. And then, as more and more freedoms happened, there became a class stratification became possible that had not been possible with the housing segregation and the school segregation. And so then there was a rising middle class of African Americans, and a lot of that community spirit. I remember Toni Cade Bambara wrote about that very feelingly, that some of that spirit was lost. And it strikes me as a lot the same, where the out lesbian culture was working class, because there was no such thing as an out lesbian middle class culture that I remember. And now there's all kinds of ways to be, an out lesbian who's middle class or upper middle class. And I wonder if that's going to make it more difficult to have the kind of solidarity you're talking about as necessary.
Well, I don't know. I think the solidarity now needs to be not only on maintaining women-centeredness, but also earth-centeredness. And so that expands the whole idea of what needs to happen. It means, being called a tree hugger or whatever, and living in ways that are just overtly made fun of in the patriarchal media of, understanding connections to the moon and the cycles of Earth and creatureness and what that consists of. It's crucially important to do that, no matter how much fun is made of anyone for doing it. Because if we don't change our philosophical identifications, we're just going to continue replicating the patterns that we can see clearly are very destructive. I'm thinking about Susan Griffin put in place, this description in her book Woman in Nature, which was in the 70s, that she culminated some thought forms that are in the poetry, if you take a look at the poetry, but she articulated it very, very beautifully in her poetic prose, that the patriarchy perceives both women and nature as inferior or as for the purpose of producing something for the patriarchy to consume and to use. So from that place, ecofeminism continued, to develop, and it's a crucially important movement. It has spread around the world, and already existed among many indigenous women's groupings, who fought back, women and men, fighting back against the incipient sexist and racist and, I guess you could say, earthist kinds of prejudice that patriarchal capitalism imposes on everything, everywhere it goes. So to fight back against that means a different kind of solidarity, in a sense, a solidarity that moves beyond just loving your cat to protecting the birds that your cat might eat, and probably does eat or kill and just leave somewhere. You know what I mean? There's a kind of sentimentality that has to be broken through. So I hope I'm not wandering off someplace.
No,
here.
I think that's a really important. I just am thinking of how many lesbians are resistant to that. Like you say, it's a breaking through a kind of thought. It's not enough to just love your cat. And I was also thinking what a great place to swing the conversation over to this journal of menstruation and culture that's online, Metaformia, where you are the editor. And can you speak, which to me is on the very subject you're talking about, this ecofeminism and the taking of positions that some people might find something they can ridicule, and the courage to stay with those connections. So can you talk about what Metaformia is and why you formed it?
Sure. I'm thinking about how it is that women in the U.S. in particular just undertook to reclaim women's bodies. We reclaimed sexuality, and we reclaimed things like breastfeeding and so on as not only appropriate but necessary for bonding of mother and child, but also we reclaimed menstruation, which had been deeply shamed in the centuries prior to the 20th, people in the 20th century who worked to reverse it, having it traveled around the world and meeting people who honored menstruation and credited it with all manner of creative powers, including consciousness powers. So I started doing that, and so did some other artists. And just starting in 1970, the first poem that I wrote about menstruation was a positive poem, and from there, by 73, I was working on what was eventually, 20 years later, going to be published as Blood, Bread, and Roses, and what I now call a metaformic consciousness, a consciousness about the creative powers that derive from menstruation. So it's a philosophy, and I remain convinced it's the most important thing that I could possibly have done in my life.
Well, and there's this on the splash page, and this is Metaformia, metaformia.org, metaformia.org. There's the first page is what is Metaformia, and under Under that, there's metaformic theory is important because, and I want to just read the fourth point under that. Menstrual theories teach that synchrony is a primary basis for evolution, women's solidarity, and intelligence, rather than our isolation, weakness, or sinfulness, which are emphasized. Let's see, teach that synchrony. Teach that.
Yes,
women can help each other lose the shame and confusion of not knowing where we fit in as culture movers and shakers and become engaged, active participants. This encourages and enables women to, for example, intelligently struggle to gain a full measure of control within institutions that affect them related to health in our bodies, motherhood, sexuality, the economy, marriage, education, and children's welfare, religion, government, science, military, the welfare of the planet, and so on. I find it intriguing that you see menstruation, which, as you note, has been sort of seen as this sinful, dirty mark of our inferiority and shame, and you're seeing it as a linchpin for empowerment and initiating social change. How did you arrive at that?
Well, it took a while. I thought that I wanted to know what women had contributed to science and culture. So I thought that at the very least I would find out that women had something to do with calendars and calendar time. But what actually fell out after I looked at the many rituals from cultures around the world. There's like 2,000 cultures, and so many of them had very powerful coming-of-age rituals. And somebody like Sir James Frazer, who collected anecdotes and accounts of that Westerners were astonished to find when they began exploring the world in the 19th century, that the power of these rituals, when I put them at the center, instead of putting hunting at the center, instead of putting a male blood ritual at the center, I thought, what would happen if I put a female blood ritual at the center? And the moment I did that, everything fell into a new place. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life articulating, what those new places are they're right there. They're inherent in the collection of data of the stories and myths and practices and gestures and so on. So I put it together as a story. It was very inspired, I must say. I felt like everybody's ancestors came and gathered around me by the time I was really ready to write it all down, that I was really taking dictation by that time. And that was like 20 years into it, to do Blood, Bread, and Roses as a map. And in many ways, it's a very wonderful map, and I've taken off from there in various directions, and so have my students, because you learn this by applying it and so on. And one of the things to be pointed out that seems so obvious, but it took me a long time to get it, is that the patriarchy denigrates menstruation because menstruation indicates that the woman is not pregnant, and patriarchy is very, very concerned with male fertility. In a certain sense, you can say that patriarchy is an exercise of male fatherhood, of them learning about that, and so they put that at the center. And so menstruation is an indication of male failure to impregnate, which is projected as female failure to get pregnant. Well, we can pass on from there very, very easily and reclaim all the power that was suppressed by menstruation. The more it was suppressed, the more powerful probably it was, So, and we can reclaim some rituals that are peace-based. They're not war-based, and that's so crucial. It isn't that men are necessarily more violent than women, but their rituals, excuse me, their rituals are because they acquire the blood to be human beings with consciousness by cutting themselves or other beings or punching their wife in the face or whatever. And women don't do that. Women have women's rituals are about seeing other red fruiting beings in nature and identifying with them, bringing them home as babies and nurturing them and letting them grow up in the yard and taking care of them. And pretty soon, here's horticulture. So it's exciting. You can tell that I get overly excited about it every time I talk about it because there's so much to it, and I'm so crave people who are.
Well, I think there is, just when you're sort of talking about male blood rituals as being sort of the hunt or war or something, and then the female blood rituals as this stemming from menstruation, which is about life and, organic change, cycles, all that.
Right, right.
It's completely different, and I feel like we are living in a time that is, the blood rituals of men have taken over the planet, and to the point where we're just literally destroying the planet. And one of the things that is new and different about the male violence in this particular manifestation is that it seems as if the U.S., because, there's no new worlds to conquer, we're in a permanent war economy that probably, if we ceased all military activity immediately without any shift in any direction, everybody's 401k would plummet. It is the largest single contractor. If you're doing socially responsible investing, they will tell you won't find a company that doesn't do business with the military, so the best we can offer is let's try to find one that does less than 15% of their business is the military. It's in everything. Exactly. And so it's difficult to avoid it. And even if you're a pacifist, if you have a retirement account, you're leaning into that military. It is instead of colonialism, it's this permanent war economy. And I sort of despair of how on earth are we going to move away from that now that it has infiltrated so thoroughly our economic system. And I love that your idea, it's just a blood ritual. It's a mindset. It's putting something at the center of your creation myth, your understanding of your place in the universe. Right.
And of how to solve problems. You solve the problem by sending a tank at it rather than to all get in the sauna and then have a peaceful discussion, or all go and spend 7 days in nature giving presents to all the trees that you see, and then making a theater piece out of that. There isn't any reason why that couldn't be the economy. An economy is an agreed-on exchange, right? So.
Yeah, and the difference doesn't need to be threatening. In a dominant hierarchical structure, difference must be colonized or obliterated. Those are your two choices. But if you're looking at, the women's way of doing things, difference is natural. It's a big, I don't agree, but, that's you. And, not all these conflicts need to be hammered out. What if we just, can tolerate difference? You believe in this, I believe in that, But, I agree. I think, but I think part of it is that's the tree hugging. That's the part that's ridiculous. The real world is the world of war. That's what the real adults engage in. And the kind of activities you're talking about is that's the stuff that makes people roll their eyes, or that's considered childish. What could be more childish than bombing people you don't agree with? I mean, that to me is childish.
No, it's very, very childish. It's like, no impulse control. But it's also a philosophical stance. It's a belief that the war machine is the way to solve problems, or that the gambling economy is the most important economy, when and what needs to simply be taught and said and repeated and insisted on is the enormity of economy, that economy is ecology and eco-feminist,
mm-hmm.
that, economy is community, that if you write down, and especially if you've had some trauma in your life, like a big illness, write down what matters to you the most. Making a lot of money slides way down the list, and as it should, because it's just a form of gambling. It's just a form of collecting. It's not about what's actually sustaining. What's actually sustaining is family, community, spirituality, all the creature life that's all around us, all the little microbes that take care of us from inside that we've learned to treat as if they are enemies in a war, and they're not. They're us. They're more.
And I notice in my own thinking, because we live in a culture here in the U.S. that does not really cover you in old age and definitely doesn't cover you in terms of health care, is that I get nervous about the future, but when I'm fully present and engaged in sacred activity, that I don't have any consciousness of that future anxiety at all.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, what you're talking about, what actually sustains you. And, of course, I get mesmerized by, having, money in the bank account and working enough where my Social Security will blah, blah, blah. But what really sustains me has nothing to do with any of that. It's those things you just mentioned. It's just very easy to lose sight of that because, like you note, we're in that paradigm where the blood rights of men are the central organizing principle of the culture. And I love that your Metaformia is kind of like, well, it's what a poet's job is. You put the lever right on the fulcrum to move things. And you can really crank away on the lever and wear yourself out if it's not placed correctly. And I feel like the poets and the visionaries of a culture make sure that when we are attempting social change, we've got it right where it needs to happen, which, as you say, it's in the intuitive realm. It's in the realm of myth. It's in our whole understanding of what our place in the cosmos is. That's where you place it. And this Metaformia, it would transform everything.
Yes, it would transform everything. That's right. And, speaking of it as the work of a poet, that's what the word means, that the metaform is a metaphor, saying that one thing is like another, turned into a form. So the example I like to give is an apple, that, an apple is red. Our ancestors were attracted to red fruits, and they saw these trees as being mothers like themselves. So I call the apple, which is, in a sense, it's the menstruation of the apple tree. I call it a metaform, meaning, it's a metaphor for menstruation, but it's also a form of menstruation, and it's real. It's not made up. It's it's not like an archetype. That exists in the psychic realm, as a psychological realm. This exists in the everyday realm, and that's why it's possible to learn this by doing it. And that's something I totally believe in, that education needs to increasingly go in that direction, teach us how to think with nature in mind, and by making an application and doing something. I believe that's how social change comes about. So I'm optimistic about this, even in the face of everything that we know about where the world is going. But we also know that people can change, rituals change. We can't change being metaformic, but we can change the kinds of rituals that we engage in. And we can turn away from being so enthralled by the drama of the male blood rituals, and we can go toward these connectivity rituals that women's cultures developed all over the world, and the men associated with them who also helped develop them and accounted for them and so on. We can do that. It's not that hard, actually.
And when you say it's not that hard, would you talk about that? And I'd also be fascinated to hear anything you have to say about rituals that you personally have developed or that you participate in.
Well, rituals that I see people engaging in that are changing things have to do with taking charge of their own teenagers as they come of age, not just turning the girls loose and letting them fend for themselves. And
oh my God, Judy, now you're on a subject I so feel about, because I rent out a room in my apartment to students, young women, and you're exactly, they're just thrown into the war. Yes, they are starving for female mentors that are not mothers necessarily, but not necessarily authority figures either.
Right. But who are guides, who are lovely models for how to be a powerful woman without doing violence to yourself, and so on. So those kinds of things, and there are people who are doing those. You know, the Red Tent movement that Deanna Lamb does. I don't know if you've heard of that, but she goes all over the place. And women gather and they talk about their lives. And the way that people work with returning vets with art projects, the way that people work with ADD kids with art projects and movement and so on to redo it. All of those kinds of things that I see happening and coming along and being deliberately developed, those are new rituals. They're different ways of addressing the problems inherent in being human being, where we have way too much power and not enough wisdom, but to shift it toward what we could call the feminine. That's just one word for it. There are other words, the indigenous wisdom, or however, our grandmother's wisdom, or what Spirit tells us we can do. Just something, I'll give you an example of one of our students who is trained in meditation, and she worked in schools in the Bay Area. She worked with, let's say, 8th graders, where there was, let's say, a violence rate of 800 incidents a year. And she worked with these kids with mindfulness, which is a peaceful ritual, and the incidents dropped to 35 or something. I mean, just an astounding difference.
Wow. She was teaching meditation?
Yeah. But doing it in a particular way, and she had gone through our program, so I don't know exactly what her technique was, but she's now bringing pieces of our women's spirituality program and curriculum to India, and we're going to be discussing having a kind of a pan international sort of set of classes, that we do. Metaformic consciousness, I took it to India because in South India people were still doing beautiful, elaborate menarche rituals using honoring and divination and processions and hiring a band and having 10,000 people show up for the party and all those kinds of things.
You're talking about when a girl has her first menses?
Yes, that's what I'm talking about. I found people there who couldn't wait to talk to me about it. Anyway, I wanted to do a comparison between those rituals and rituals of the goddess and see if there's correlation, which doesn't prove causation, but it does imply that possibility. So that's what I did my work on. So I don't know, just saying that I don't forget where I was going with all of that.
Well, I'm fascinated about that. You did see a correlation between those two?
Oh, totally. Yes, very, very much. Yeah, it's in a dissertation that I wrote in 1999 from California Institute of Integral Studies. So, people can access it and read it if they want to. But I suggest reading Blood, Bread, and Roses first.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, so, this is all exciting, and it makes it so thrilling to have been a poet in the era that I was, and to have so completely ingrained woman-centeredness from living in these lesbian feminist households where we were activists. And so we embodied that. So for 8 years, that's who I was. And that carried over all the way through into my whole life. I still do that, and the women's spirituality programs that I'm a part of use some of that same kind of wisdom and then add to it from, all the other people who've been doing research along these lines and have devoted their lives to this kind of social change.
I think that's so important. And one of the things that liberated me, because I was very lost until I found myself as a lesbian feminist, and was this enormous permission, because nothing had been done, and theater was all by men, for men. And so even though I felt timid about my abilities, it was so liberating because it was not coming through an academic tradition. This whole women's culture was breaking down class barriers, and every woman's truth had value and all of that. And I think of now where, lesbianism is more acceptable in the academy, and of course the feminism, some say it's been colonized in the academy, and I worry about that because I think that fear of criticism, fear of looking foolish, fear of branching off in some direction that doesn't have all these male credentialed antecedents, I think women still have a great fear of that. And like this metaformic theory is tremendously courageous. But like you say, it came out of these female-centered households. My theater company came out of the women's land collectives in Southern Oregon. That's where I'd moved. And that was the audience for whom I wrote. That was my world view, was a lesbian-centric view.
Right.
Yeah, and everything changed. I didn't care what anybody outside that world thought of it. I didn't write for them.
Exactly. Yeah. But now people can look into your work from any position, where they are. They don't have to go and live on some land in order to get what you're talking about. So that's so fabulous that to have a base like that and to expand it out. And I'm sure that those land ventures were very eco-conscious. They were paying a lot of attention, in my experience of them, to what their connections with aspects of nature were. I'll never forget seeing two women carrying a box across women's land from a neighboring women's land enterprise, and where were they going with the box? Well, they were moving their rattlesnakes. They were moving them to a better home where they wouldn't be in danger of harming a human and bringing a genocide down upon themselves. You know what I mean? So.
Yes, I remember that well. There was certainly a love of the land, and also I think that spirit of revolution. I'm thinking of a collective meeting about whether or not male dogs should be allowed in these women's collectives, and it seems ridiculous now, but it was actually an incredibly profound inquiry into the nature of sex and gender. That was the heart of it. It's like, well, we now have the freedom to create a world the way we want it. So there was a great deal of attention given to what might seem laughably trivial questions, or like some people would ridicule the box of the snakes being moved. But, it was almost like there was a ritual significance to every single decision made on the women's lands, or I'm sure in these women's households, because we were self-consciously creating a different world, and we didn't want to import the same old crap.
That's right. So everything was up for question. Absolutely everything was up for question all the time.
Well, then that is what is so easy to make fun of. Like, oh my God, processing everything. The word process makes people.
Oh, I know.
But on the other hand, when I look back, that kind of conscientiousness is a really beautiful thing, and that is what you bring to ritual, full presence of mind, and that every gesture is significant. And I understand that because, of course, theater's like that. But,
sure.
But I worry because that base, those women's households, the women's land collectives, that's not the culture, especially not the lesbian culture of today. And will we be able to sustain and carry forward with momentum these ways of doing things, these cultural artifacts, these rituals from that time that was so very different? Do you really think that these will be embraced by the culture as we have it now?
Well, I think some of them already have been, although I can't give you any examples at the moment, but I honestly do believe that that they do carry forward. I think that things have carried forward from the first wave of feminism in the West. I think that some of the ideas and practices that we put in place in the 70s are still reverberating with movements all over the world that are happening, of women fighting back against Monsanto, fighting back against deforestation in India, and so on. And people continue to go through their patriarchal ages because that seems to be just a part of the human growth pattern. But hopefully they'll do it more quickly. And every single thing that we do really, really matters. I think that's a lifelong lesson that I have. And as a poet, I can see that because I see people reprinting works of mine. I just had something translated into Turkish from the only LGBT Turkish journal, and it's a history of lesbianism.
I love that poem. Oh, my gosh. I love that poem. Can you, I think I have it here. I'm going to look at I see we only have a few more minutes left, and I can't think of anything more wonderful than to close with that. Are you able to recite that?
I don't recite anything. I barely can hang on to my memory of what I'm doing from one day to the next.
I have the work of a common woman.
I write everything down. Let's say.
I know it's in the work of a common woman, so.
Yes, it is. And it's also in Love Belongs to Those Who Do the Feeling, which is out of Red Hen Press. And it's in the Judy Grahn Reader, which is out of Aunt Lute Press. So why don't I just read it? I'll put my glasses on. Give me a second here.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And this poem dates from 1970. The discussions, that we were having of what is a dyke anyway, you know what I mean. So let me just read it. History of lesbianism. How they came into the world. The women-loving women came in 3 by 3 and 4 by 4. The women-loving women came in 10 by 10 and 10 by 10 again until there were more than you could count. They took care of each other the best they knew how, and of each other's children, if they had any. How they lived in the world. The women-loving women learned as much as they were allowed and walked and wore their clothes the way they liked whenever they could. They did whatever they knew to be happy or free and worked and worked and worked. The women-loving women in America were called dykes, and some liked it and some did not. They made love to each other the best they knew how, and for the best reasons. How they went out of the world. The women-loving women went out one by one, having withstood greater and lesser trials and much hatred from other people. They went out one by one, each having tried in her own way to overthrow the rule of men over women. They tried it one by one and 100 by 100 until each came in her own way to the end of her life and died. The subject of lesbianism is very ordinary. It's the question of male domination that makes everybody angry.
Wow. Thank you. That was a privilege to hear that from the woman who wrote it.
Well, thank you. It it resonates with so much that we were talking about. And of course, you can substitute other ways of self-definition besides dyke and lesbian, and still, as long as you've got women-loving women in there, which just seems like the operative word, and including the women who are creatures and the women who are trees and so on. If there can be love for those, then there's something very, very different happening in the world of human disaster.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I see we are at our time limit here.
Okay.
That is a beautiful way to sum everything up and to close. And that poem meant so much to me when I was first beginning my life work. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jenny to wrap things up. Thank you again.
All right, and thank you, Carolyn. Thank you so much for a really, really interesting dialogue. It's just really a wonderful state of grace for me to have you be the person who interviewed me. I thank you very, very much.
Oh, you're welcome. So, Jenny?
Thank you very much, both of you, Judy Grahn and Carolyn Gage. A truly memorable and instructive interview. Thank you both. And you can learn more about Judy's work on her website, Judy Grahn in Cyberspace, at judygrahn.org. That's JUDYGRAHN.org. And Metaformia.org, a journal of menstruation and culture, how to think with nature in mind. That's Metaformia, METAFORMIA.org. And we have two of Judy's books on Green Woman's Store. We have the Judy Grahn Reader, covering 4 decades of Judy's poetry, and also Love Belongs to Those Who Do the Feeling, with new and selected poems. And Judy's newest book, where she tells the story of her life, reflecting on the profound cultural shifts brought about by the women's and gay rights movements of the 1960s and 70s. Her book is titled A Simple Revolution, The Making of an Activist Poet, and it is available at auntLute.com. That's AUNTLUTE.com. And the title again is A Simple Revolution. And we have the recording of Judy reading her poem, A History of Lesbianism, on our greenlesbian.com page. And you can sign up for Carolyn Gage's newsletter at carolyngage.com. Carolyn tours in her own shows and is available for lectures and workshops on lesbian culture and history. Thank you again, Judy Grahn and Carolyn Gage, and thank you for listening in. We hope we have informed and inspired you in many ways. And we hope you will try to catch more of the interviews in this series on feminism and sustainability, as well as our other podcast series on issues important to us as women. And please share these interviews with your family and friends. You never know who you may be inspiring. No matter what your description or experience of feminism is, we hope to have heightened your understanding of feminism's important role in all aspects of sustainability, and restored and strengthened your resolve to build alliances for the future. For it is clear that none of us are really alone. Keep listening. Bye for now.